Notes from the Underground with David Aaronovitch, Labour's Rochdale debacle, Anti-Semitism or Stupidity or Both, by David Aaronovitch. They knew in advance. Within a couple of days of the Hamas attack on southern Israel, and while the full horror of what had been done was still filtering through to us, I received my first direct tweet revealing that Israel had been warned about what was about to happen and had deliberately chosen not to prevent it. As repeated by the man who became Labour's candidate for the Rochdale by-election, Ajar Ali, at a meeting back in October, the formulation,
"The Egyptians are saying that they warned Israel 10 days earlier. Americans warned them a day before that there's something happening. They deliberately took the security off. They allowed that massacre that gives them the green light to do whatever they bloody want."
The appearance of this theory was entirely expected. As I'll explain, this is a conspiracist trope with a long history. Group A, who appear to have been attacked by Group B, in fact either let it happen on purpose, lie-hop, or, even more dastardly, made it happen on purpose, my-hop. And although Group A may seem to have suffered badly as a consequence of the attack, but in fact they stand to benefit because the new circumstances give them the pretext they need to smash Group B and thus achieve a cherished goal. An inside job, Pearl Harbor. In my book about modern conspiracism, Voodoo Histories, I went into some detail concerning two such theories. The first was the long-standing idea that Franklin D. Roosevelt, desperate to take an unwilling America into the Second World War, had somehow engineered the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The picture above shows one of many books on the subject published since the war. In August 1940, a body called Keep America Out of War renamed itself the America First Committee. It came to be led by possibly the most famous man in America, the flying ace Charles Lindbergh. Those subscribing to the anti-interventionist position of AF, including opposition to aid to a blitzed Britain, included a whole lot of novelists, the architect Frank Lloyd Wright, and the students Gerald R. Ford, John F. Kennedy, and Gore Vidal. Its main congressional support came from populist politicians from the Midwest who managed to muster significant votes against policies such as the Lend-Lease Agreement, which arguably saved Britain's bacon after the fall of France. At its height, the New York branch alone, chaired by a right-wing journalist, John T. Flynn, claimed over 130,000 members. With significant public backing, America First was a major force in inhibiting Roosevelt's freedom of action. And then the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and a few days later Tokyo's ally Germany declared war on the US, and that was the end of America First. In 1944 there was a presidential election, and an ailing FDR stood for a fourth term. A month before the vote, Flynn published a 32-page pamphlet, The Truth About Pearl Harbor. Its thesis was summed up by Flynn as this:
By January 1, 1941, Roosevelt had decided to go to war with Japan. But he had solemnly pledged the people he would not take their sons to foreign wars unless attacked. Hence, he dared not attack, and so decided to provoke the Japanese to do so.
The smoking gun that Flynn thought he possessed was the velation that by December 1941, part of the Japanese naval code had been broken, and therefore Roosevelt knew what was coming and decided not to prevent it. This trope formed the basis of a long-lived conspiracy theory advocated by historians such as Charles A. Beard, and carried on well into the 21st century, not least by the novelist Gore Vidal. You'll still find it online. In fact, though, parts of the Japanese code had indeed been cracked. Most of the messages hadn't actually been deciphered and translated until significantly after the attack. In any case, a leader would have to be insane to risk half his navy in order to provide a pretext. You can see that in this case it's a political version of the old soccer "we was robbed" psychology, in which defeat is to be explained by some kind of conspiracy. Just as the US peace movement was blindsided by the attacks on the Twin Towers in 2001 and found themselves comprehensively out of fashion. An inside job, 9/11. If Pearl Harbor was lie-hop, the 9/11 truth movement based itself around a my-hop theory. It's so complicated and daft, involving empty airliners, skyscrapers rigged with explosives and fake passengers, that I don't have space here to go into it. Yet hundreds of American academics signed up for the idea, and an online video called Loose Change was one of the earliest indicators that big money could be made by selling conspiracist nonsense to the punters. The stupid Mr. Ali. Both theories shared another feature. If you think about them seriously for a few minutes, it should be obvious just how utterly improbable they are. Roosevelt risks his whole fleet. George W. Bush, if that's who you blame, presides over the most complex conspiracy ever undertaken, involving thousands of people, as well as the destruction of a large part of his country's financial and business center, all to give him a pretext to invade Afghanistan. And in the case of Gaza, the Israeli government deliberately ignores warnings from intelligence sources in the hope that a devastating Hamas attack which will kill hundreds, supposedly being protected by the same government, and take hostage numerous others, will permit it to launch an attack on Gaza in which even more Israelis will be killed. So Mr. Ali probably should have been suspended in the first instance for the sin of utter, willful stupidity. The Israeli lie-hop may well have been a trope that was widely shared among people he knew, but that hardly excuses him from working out for himself how preposterous it was. Who needs more MPs that thick? But anti-Semitic? So stupid, yes, but in what way anti-Semitic? The Pearl Harbor and 9/11 theories for the most part could hardly be said to be racist accusations. If they did have a strangely racist dimension, it would be in suggesting that Arabs weren't capable of a brilliant, though horrific act of organized violence on 9/11. That the guileless Japanese had been a kind of mega-patsy who had allowed themselves to further Roosevelt's ambitions by being drawn into bombing the Pegasus out of the US Navy, and that the leadership PF Hamas was sufficiently brain-dead to be gulled into launching the kind of deadly assault that would inevitably lead to an overwhelming Israel response. Poor silly Hamas, eh? This is where it gets tricky. Within 4 days of the 9/11 attacks, a Syrian newspaper stated that 4,000 Jews had been unaccountably absent from their work in the Twin Towers area on the day of the explosions. This fiction was repeated by the TV station of Hezbollah in Lebanon, and then went round the world. The origin for this story was a deliberate misreading of a report in the Jerusalem Post stating that the Israeli Foreign Ministry has so far received the names of 4,000 Israelis believed to have been in the areas of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon at the time of the attacks. When 4,000 Israelis didn't turn up among the bodies, well, where had they been? A lot of them had never existed, of course. The figure stuck. Lamentably, a few months after the attack, one of the US most celebrated black poets, Amiri Baraka, published a poem entitled "Somebody Blew Up America," including the lines,
"Who knew the World Trade Center was going to get bombed? Who told 4,000 Israeli workers at the Twin Towers to stay home that day? Why did Sharon stay away?"
The implication, of course, was that Israel, infernally clever and devilishly devious, had engineered the fall of the towers in order to achieve whatever the accuser wanted to imagine. Some aspect of this blame Israel knee-jerk owes a debt not just to anti-Semitism but to philo-Semitism, the idea that Jews are somehow cleverer and better than anyone else, and conspiracism involving Jews can affect even highly intelligent Jews. I won't name him, but a rightly celebrated Jewish columnist who is definitively pro-Israel once wrote a column which tolerated the theory that the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, who died in November 2004, aged 75, might have been offed by Mossad, possibly using polonium. Nonsense, of course. All I can say is, I warned him. And it's fun to think that if he were to switch sides and stand as a Labour candidate, someone might retrieve that column and get him suspended. The bringing of the Jew-S into a conspiracy theory that was, in any case, daft enough without them signifies something that most students of conspiracy theories know, which is that someone somewhere will implicate Jews in whatever conspiracy it was, from the murder of Robert Maxwell to the death of Princess Diana. The reasons why Jews are the particular targets of this malign thinking is a subject for another time. But of course, in the case of the October 7th, you can't implicate Israel in such a plot without implicating Jews, since Jews were both the victims and are now the avengers. Which is why I would initially have been inclined to give Ali the benefit of the doubt over anti-Semitism per se, but convict him of stupidity. The Jewish media, But then it transpired that at the same meeting, when talking about the earlier suspension of the Corbynite MP Andy MacDonald for proclaiming a river-to-the-sea ambition, Mr. Ali allegedly said that MacDonald's fate had been the work of people in the media from certain Jewish quarters. Now, that one is straightforwardly anti-Semitic. It belongs to the category of top anti-Jewish tropes, the Jew as mind manipulator. And it should have had everyone in the room who heard it at the very least muttering shame. That one you don't get to come back from. But as it happens at the very same meeting, and by now you have to be wondering what exactly this was a meeting of, it may be that by the time I publish this, we will have found out. Another Labour candidate in the Northwest, Graham Jones, had also delivered himself of some problematic sentiments. He had called Israel fucking Israel, and opined that British citizens who fought for the IDF should be locked up. I have to stress that I am taking this information on good faith from the Mail and the Guido Fawkes site. Not very useful language or proposals from Mr. Jones, but are they anti-Semitic? With fucking Israel context could be everything. It is a peculiar formulation, but I guess a lot of people have said fucking Russia in the last 2 years. By the way, in case anyone has forgotten, the second anniversary of Putin's invasion of Ukraine is almost upon us, and Ukrainian soldiers and civilians are still dying. Are they Russophobes? Fucking Netanyahu would be far safer, though. After all, we've all said that. On the other hand, what other countries has Mr. Jones applied the F word to? Myanmar, Syria, or just Israel? As for the Britons fighting for the IDF being imprisoned, well, that sounds pretty much like someone who should know better running his mouth to show others how cross he can be. Jones may have no idea just how threatening it sounds to British Jews who have dual nationality reservist relatives called up for the IDF. Maybe his big problem is a failure of moral imagination. He certainly doesn't seem to know the law. So where does this leave us? As the story has unfolded, the Corbynites have been almost ecstatic, their only problems being that they are A, they aren't keen on associating with Ali's comments, and B, they are therefore in effect forced now to accuse the hated Starmer of the sin of consistency. Some journalists have excitedly labelled the Rochdale debacle as Starmer's biggest crisis. I doubt it. The loss of Hartlepool in the by-election in May 2021, according to Wikipedia, only the second time since 1982 that the governing party gained a seat in a by-election, and gained it overwhelmingly, was a much worse moment, I'd argue. Nor do I accept that Starmer has been slow to act. The accusation of a delay of 5 hours coming from the Conservative Party of Boris Johnson and the Partygate inquiries feels tepid. Meanwhile, I note that Ali's further remarks suggested that the Israeli lie-hop conspiracy had the ostensible motive as being to get rid of the Palestinians from Gaza and grab the land. This is, of course, nonsense, but it is nonsense that is turbocharged by the various eliminationist statements made by the neo-fascist members of the Israeli cabinet. There is new talk of a ceasefire. Let's hope this bloody war ends soon before we all lose our minds.